Good morning, afternoon, or evening, everyone, depending on where you are. And welcome to this very interesting, very distinguished panel called A Genealogy of Resistance, Passing on the Ethos of Interracial and Working Class Solidarity. We have three wonderful presenters this afternoon who will speak for about 15 to 20 minutes, sharing their work. And then I'll ask a sort of sounding off question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So please do be having questions in mind as each speaker talks, and we look forward to hearing from you all as well. So I'll start by reading the paper titles and the bios, and folks will present in the order that you see in the program, which is the order in which I'll read the bios. So first we have Robert Zecker. He'll be presenting a paper titled A People's University, Communist Workers' Schools in America, 1930 to 1954. He is a professor of history at St. Francis Xavier University in Nova Scotia, Canada. He teaches courses in U.S. history with specialties in race, immigration, and ethnicity in America. He is the author of 4 books, most recently A Road to Peace and Freedom, The International Workers' Order, and The Struggles for Economic Justice and Civil Rights, 1930 to 1954. With Temple University Press. In addition, Dr. Zecker has published numerous articles on race and immigration in journals such as the Journal of American Ethnic History, American Communist History, and the Journal of Social History, and has chapters in 5 edited volumes. Before entering academia, he toiled in daily journalism in the United States. Felicia Bevel will be presenting a paper titled Old Man River Revised, Harold Blair and the Continuation of Paul Robeson's Legacy in Australia. She is an assistant professor of history at the University of North Florida. Her research and teaching interests include African American history, 20th century U.S. history, cultural history, Southern studies, and childhood studies. Her current research examines early 20th century American cultural productions that romanticize the Old South and circulated outside of the U.S. within the larger Pacific world, specifically in Canada and Australia. Her work has been supported by the Ford Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Florida Education Fund. At UNF, she teaches courses on topics such as the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Pacific, and Blackness in Archives, and serves on the advisory boards of the Digital Humanities Institute and Africana Studies. She holds a PhD in American Studies from Brown University and a BA in Sociology with a concentration in African American Studies from Columbia University. Ian Rocksborough-Smith will be presenting the paper Jack H.P. Odell's Impact on Activist Intellectuals in the Pacific Northwest. He teaches primarily U.S. history at the University of the Fraser Valley in Abbotsford, BC, Canada. Ian, do you want to share the indigenous name? I don't know how to pronounce it.
It's Stalotemek.
Okay, thank you. His research interests include public and urban history, social movements, and histories of race, labor, religion, and empire in the Atlantic world. He has published academic articles and book reviews in a variety of journals like the Black Scholar, Journal of Black Studies and Research Reviews, Reviews in American History, and the Journal of the Illinois State Historical Society, and has a book entitled Black Public History in Chicago, Civil Rights Activism from World War II into the Cold War. He has written op-eds in Canadian Dimensions and The Conversation Canada, and is on the editorial team for Labor Online, which is the online blog for LAUCHA, or what does LAUCHA stand for again?
Association.
Labor and Working Class History Association. He has served as an International Solidarity and Human Rights Officer for his faculty union, Local 7 of the Federation of Post-Secondary Employees of British Columbia. So let's go ahead and hear from Dr. Robert Zecker.
Okay, thank you very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And I want to thank ASA for doing these online panels, for making up for last fall's Solidarity with Gaza March. Nearly a century before learning outcomes and metrics were ever heard of, critics of education argued public schools were designed to turn out nothing more than obedient cogs for corporate America. From the left aisle of the classroom, workers in the orbit of the Communist Party argued schools were agents of indoctrination designed to instill quiescent, interchangeable workers. Fortunately, the party established a network of workers' schools, in the words of Chicago's Workers' School, quote, to equip the workers with the knowledge and the understanding of Marxist-Leninism so worker students could engage in militant struggle toward the decisive proletarian victory. Such strident third-period rhetoric would be tempered as workers' schools adjusted later to the Popular Front, but schools such as New York's Jefferson School and Chicago's Abraham Lincoln School continued to offer courses in Marxism, even as they offered a progressive American narrative. Such schools pioneered in teaching some of the country's first school courses in African American history and labor and working class history, and championed humanities as a form of adult education for workers of hand and brain. Today, then, I'll present an overview of the CP workers' schools and their effort to offer class-conscious education while disseminating, as the Jefferson School phrased it, the best of all thinking in past history, the works of the great theoretical leaders of the working class movement and the democratic heritage of the American nation. The deficiencies of public education were spelled out in 1925 by Max Bedock, later a general secretary of the International Workers' Order. What is workers' education, he asked in the Workers' Monthly, before detailing the means by which the educational machinery created the mentality and psychology of the masses, which falls an easy victim to the guiles of the capitalist press and the preachers, which succumbs so easily to the germs of patriotic paroxysms without any attempt at resistance. Capitalist schools, Bedock argued, had to give the prospective wage slaves the intellectual requirements to make him a useful tool in the profit mills of present-day society. To counter this indoctrination, the party established a network of people's universities, the workers' schools. The flagship was the New York Workers' School, founded in 1923 under the direction of East Harlem dentist Abraham Markov. The school provided a Marxist counter-pedagogy to students unwilling to become useful tools. The school offered courses in the principles of communism, Marxism, Leninism, and historical materialism, and was frank that its mission was training for the class struggle. The Workers' School Weekly published winners of student essay contest, Why I Came to the Workers' School, which showed pupils welcomed the training. Winning entrants answered, because there is class struggle, I have learned that no ruling class relinquishes its power peacefully, and because it teaches the absurdity of reform by law. A school pamphlet touted the workers' school attraction, asserting no public school in the United States dared to teach the truth about the struggle between workers and employers. Markoff similarly noted in July 1934 that Earl Browder addressed the school's faculty, emphasizing the importance of bringing about a real Bolshevik struggle in the teaching of Marxism-Leninism in our schools. The following year, a Chicago workers' school asserted, the workers' school is not purely an academic institution. It participates in all the current struggles of the working class. It takes part in strikes, campaigns, and demonstrations. 2 years later, Chicago was still advertising that its courses were based upon the principles of scientific socialism and deal primarily with social, political, and economic problems presented from an authoritative Marxist viewpoint. Praxis went to the head of the class. When a New York school workers' school contingent marched in 1934's May Day parade, they succinctly chanted, "Don't be a boss's tool. Learn to fight at the workers' school." And I don't know about everybody else, but I like these guys' rhetoric, if nothing else. Yet while the class struggle remained front and center, already by the mid-1930s, the schools were expanding in two ways. The curriculum grew in offering many courses in the broader humanities, and workers' schools saw children and adults not just in large cities, but in many smaller places as well. From 1933 to 35, the Daily Worker had a column, What's Doing in the Workers' School, which demonstrated the depth of offerings, pedagogical and geographical. Already in 1934, James Ford, recently communist vice presidential candidate, and James Allen were offering course in Problems of the Negro Liberation Movement, which covered Negro history from colonial times to the present, highlighting the revolutionary traditions of the Negro people, which have been buried by bourgeois and reformist historians. The schools offered a mix of ethnic culture, training in public speaking and union organizing, but also history lessons from America's submerged ethno-racial and working class past. Already in 1930, organizers had classes in Black anti-colonialism, which featured homages to Toussaint Louverture and argued that it is the duty of every Negro and militant white worker to join in commemoration of the heroic deeds of the Haitian Revolution, a message certainly not offered in public schools. The Harlem Workers' School in 1934 offered a lesson in history of the Negro in America with lectures on what has capitalism done for the Negro. No bonus points if you answered not much. Similar courses on Black anti-colonial history were already in 1934 taught at workers' schools in St. Louis, Brooklyn, Los Angeles, Detroit, Buffalo, even Newport, Illinois. The valorization of African-American history continued in the schools as the party swung into its Popular Front period, which communists asserted, like General Secretary Earl Browder, communism was updated Americanism for the 20th century. Schools after 1935 claimed prominent historical figures as progressive icons. They were urged in 1936 to stress the revolutionary historical role of Lincoln and to link up their present struggle with the revolutionary traditions of the past, lest fascist falsifiers claim all that is valuable in the historical past of the nation so that fascists may bamboozle the masses. Workers' schools embraced Lincoln as well as that great liberationist son of the Negro people, Frederick Douglass, as part of the American genealogy. The emphasis on progressive Americanism led, of course, to some unintended ironies. Popular Front communists at New York's Jefferson School celebrated both Jefferson and Negro slave revolts, another course offered, as progressive American icons. The school charged, though, that it did a better job at conveying the progressive achievements of Americans of all backgrounds, Jefferson among them, noting our public school system is pitifully weak in transmitting American history to the youth of our country. What was unusual, though, was that workers' schools offered courses by Herbert Aptheker on, again, Negro slave revolts at all. Earlier, Elizabeth Lawson of the New York School gave a course in the history of the American Negro history, offering some of the first rejoiners to the dominant public school canard on Reconstruction as the era of Negro misrule. Likewise, she presented Gabriel Prosser and Denmark Vesey as heroes. New York Workers' School, Chicago's Lincoln School, and the Jeff were some of the only majority white venues in which African-American agency and self-liberation was recognized at all. Indeed, in 1939, Angelo Herndon reported in the Daily Worker on an examination of public schools' treatment of African Americans and condemned the patronizing stereotypes that littered books in both the New York area and, of course, the American South. Into the 1950s, as Clarence Taylor has noted, New York public schools still taught Africans were backward and that slavery had been beneficial. Workers' schools, on the other hand, championed Madison Washington, the Amistad Rebels, and Harriet Tubman, decades before critical race theory gave DeSantis the jitters. Other innovative humanities courses, while anchored in a Marxist pedagogy, expanded workers' horizons. New York School in 1934 had courses in social forces in American history, history of science and technology, colonial questions, and revolutionary interpretation of modern literature. Los Angeles students could take Emancipation of Women, taught by a specialist in social medicine. In Chicago's course in art and literature, where am I? There were also, of course, proletarian literature taught. Some of the first places talking about Melville and later Mike Gold and people like that. Drawing and illustration, dramatics were already proving popular with children and adults enrolled in Cleveland, although that school also had a course in Russian history. Workers' schools in Queens, Crowns Heights, Brooklyn, Harlem, and Detroit had drama and art courses. The schools also were noted in the Daily Worker column that I mentioned, offering courses in places like Eugene, Oregon, Sacramento, Jersey City, Bayonne, Oklahoma City, Worcester, Massachusetts, New Brunswick, New Jersey. Most intriguing to me, anyhow, was that in May 1934, there was a farm school on wheels that offered courses in the back of a truck, organizing in rural areas of North and South Dakota. A similar course had already been offered in Arkansas. The Dakota Farm School on Wheels was reported to be a traveling school complete in itself with tents, cooking equipment, library, and a truck with a staff of 3 instructors. As Markoff lamented, even Philadelphia sometimes had trouble maintaining its school. So I don't know how systemic or long-lasting that school was, but they were reaching out beyond the usual New York, Chicago kind of places. There was a demand, evidently, for counterhegemonic instruction. Already, immigrant radicals, such as members of the Slovak Workers section, affiliated with the party-led International Worker Order, had a network of workers' schools offering classes in New York, Cleveland, Detroit, Philadelphia, but even smaller places like East Akron, Youngstown, and Bel Air, Ohio. As with enrollees in the workers' schools, the radical Slovaks appreciated the liberatory possibility of art with theater, choral groups, and film and painting classes on offer at the Chicago Slovak School. A rare opportunity to learn and have a bit of fun, too. By World War II, the schools were part of a left-wing network which served as a people's university, in the words of a Polish paper, in speaking about the Chicago Abraham Lincoln School. In 1942, more than 4,000 Black, white, and Hispanic students flocked to school classes at the Lincoln School, including courses in propaganda analysis, the People's War, Spanish, basic English, Russian, economics, history, psychology, art, music, writing short stories, public speaking, labor problems, and the history and culture of racial and national groups. Such schools combining practical skill with liberation and education in subjugated people's history and culture, were welcomed by students such as a young pioneer who wrote Away with Bross's Propaganda. Similarly, the New York Workers' School urged students study as you fight and offered a course in Giants of American Democracy, co-taught by Louis Budens. That's a little ironic later. By learning from mighty movements of the people throughout the ages and from their leaders, Jefferson, Paine, Lincoln, Douglas, Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin, Browder, and Foster, we will be better equipped to fight the battles of today. Other courses were Women in the People's War, co-taught by Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, History of the Negro People and the War, the Italian people and the war, and the Jewish people in the war. After 1944, the New York School rechristened itself the Jefferson School and became the premier workers' school. It offered, again, a variety of courses, slave revolts, art, literature, but also, yes, a Marxist institute. By 1950, though, and I'm skipping, and I know hopefully I'm good in time, it was possible to take a course in mystery story writing. And you know who your teacher was? Dashiell Hammett. You could also take painting classes with Philip Evergood, or another session with Anton Refrigerer, I can never say his name, both in the Metropolitan Museum of Art right now, by the way. Hugo Gellert and Charles White, the African-American artist, taught painting and drawing, creative fiction classes with Myra Page and Howard Fast, Black history, Shakespeare, creative writing. All of this, the Jefferson School proclaimed, was know-how for progressives. The school, it said students come to the Jefferson School solely because they believe the school helped them understand the world we live in. The Jefferson called itself, again, a people's university designed to help workers achieve that education which can enable them to change their world through even better understanding of it. The school said it was committed to workers, again, of hand and brain, for it knows that these are not only the most numerous group in our society, but it is their thought and struggle that which lies the promise of the future. Paul Robeson taught at the school, Du Bois as well, and for a time it seemed that progressive pedagogy was a growth industry. The Jeff had annexes in Brooklyn, the Bronx, Newark, New Jersey, Queens, Westchester, and also had its lectures published, and they were available to some of those schools more further away from the New York area. The New York Herald Tribune in 1945 approvingly reported the Jeff had annually enrolled 14,000 students, and that the leftist school has been copied in 7 other cities, citing the Samuel Adams School in Boston, among others. This experiment in adult education, the Republican paper noted, is a strong trend toward the realization of the dream of a people's university, an educational forum geared to the needs of citizenship in a democracy, rather than just self-development or heightened individual awareness. The bemused Herald Tribune wondered, does this mean that a new educational year is beginning to leaven in the country? The paper had soon its answer. In 1947, the progressive schools were already in the crosshairs of HUAC, the Attorney General's list of subversive education, and others. Schools were stigmatized for preaching the heresy of anti-colonialism or scientific Marxism, but also for teaching racial equality. The IWO's Jewish Children's School of Chelsea, Massachusetts, near Boston, was condemned by HUAC as the Little Red Schoolhouse, where lessons favoring Black civil rights were decried as part of a deliberate communist conspiracy to inflame racial and religious minorities here against the United States. A teacher countered in a letter to a local newspaper defending the teaching of interracial democracy at the school, but local red baiters were unmoved. Many school boards, including New York City's, barred IWO use of public schools for their schools. The Jefferson School faced declining enrollments and crushing legal bills as it fought designation on the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations. Senator McCarthy hounded the director of the school, African-American educator Doxy Wilkerson, over his publication, Special Problems in Negro Education, saying during a televised subcommittee hearing, "I don't care what they do with your book after they remove it, whether they burn it or not." Letters to African-American newspapers such as the Pittsburgh Courier or the Amsterdam News defended Wilkerson and the school, but in an escalating rest scare, students increasingly stayed away. In 1955, the Daily Worker published articles saying the cash-strapped school needed more students to enroll, while the school sent letters to all former students urging them to return for more classes. The school's directors pleaded with the public, "Don't let McCarthyism darken the halls of learning," and vowed, "We Americans will not live in fearful silence," but in November of 1956, the school did close. In announcing its demise, Jefferson's board wrote that they were sure the school would rise again. It didn't. They were also confident that the understanding and inspiration provided by the school will live on in the minds of its many thousands of students, and that it will continue to be reflected in their daily lives. Well, this is to conclude, many school alumni did continue working in the civil rights activism of the 60s, peace activism, other causes. Alternative schools did rise again through the efforts of SDS, the Mississippi Freedom Summer, and other liberationist organizations, but the curriculum of dissent had to be reconnected after the government tore it apart, with much lost momentum. Worker schools did offer a liberating pedagogical genealogy to counter, I would argue, to the contemporary privatized, marketized, conservatized, if that's a word, educational regime. In a neo-Dickensian world where monetization and suppression of free speech, Exhibit A, my alma mater, Columbia, has replaced much of the liberal arts, we must look to an earlier era's People University for instruction. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very illuminating paper. We'll move on to Dr. Felicia Bevel.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to also thank the ASA, particularly Christine Sell, for sort of putting all this together, as well as my fellow panelists and chair. I'm going to be sharing my screen, so let me pull that up. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. Okay, so today I'll be talking about interracial solidarity across the Pacific, particularly looking at two figures, Paul Robeson and Harold Blair, and the ways in which they envisioned alliances in resistance to settler colonialism. Sitting in front of a small Christmas tree, Paul Robeson smiles down at a group of children in an Australian television studio. With hands neatly folded in front of them or on their laps, and dressed in their Sunday best, the children gaze intently at Robeson as he sings Silent Night and explains the meaning of Christmas. As the magazine in which this photograph appears notes, the children and the rest of the country who turned into this Christmas Eve special were in for a, quote, Christmas treat. As he sings to this group of diverse children, Robeson forecasts a future Australian nation where people of color equally belong, where policies that uphold the association of nationhood with whiteness crumble, and where Aboriginal Australians no longer face settler colonial violence. The above-mentioned scene was one of numerous performances, press conferences, and other public appearances that Robeson gave during his 1960 concert tour in Australia. Occurring right after the actor suffered almost a decade-long persecution within the US Cold War surveillance complex, during which the State Department stripped him of his passport and prevented him from physically leaving the country due to his support of the Soviet Union, critique of the US, as well as his leftist politics, demonstrated by his membership in organizations such as the International Workers' Order, which my colleague Bob Zecker has written a lot about in his book. This concert tour functioned in many ways as an act of resistance to his containment. Yet it also captured the intersection of artistry and activism that defined the actor's career, even and perhaps especially during his containment. Throughout this tour, Robeson mesmerized audiences with his deep, soothing voice, a voice that audiences around the world had already very come to easily recognize for his enchanting rendition of songs like Old Man River and Ballad for Americans. Yet he also used his performative voice to express his politics, which in the context of this Australian tour materialized as critiques of the White Australia policy, which I will explain later, and calls for Aboriginal Australian rights. By revising song lyrics to change their meaning from one of oppression to resistance, and by prefacing and concluding performances with critiques of discrimination against Aboriginal Australians, the actor challenged articulations of settler colonialism in Australia. He deployed a specific representation of Blackness to project a different vision of indigeneity that defined Aboriginal Australians as owners of the land and as citizens within a multicultural modern Australia within a moment where they were not considered as such. Carol Hess, Shana Redmond, Tony Perucci, Gerald Horn, and Lindsay R. Swindle are among a host of scholars who have examined Paul Robeson's use of performance as protest. As they have explored, he frequently used the stage as a launch pad for his politics, rendering, quote, artistry as revolutionary, as the apt title of Gerald Horne's biography of Robeson attests. Sharing his voice with audiences from all walks of life, he used these moments as entry points for building solidarity with and advocating for oppressed people both near and far. From showing support for African and Asian independence movements by sending a recording of himself singing Old Man River to the 1955 Bandung Conference, as Shana Redmond details in her book, to bringing together working class Americans and Canadians during his 1952 Peace Arch concert along the US-Canadian border. As you can see from these examples, he protested through performance in spite of, and perhaps explicitly because of, his physical containment at the hands of the US government. This support of people of color fighting against white supremacy abroad shaped his concert tour in Australia. During one of his final performances, he declared, quote, "I am coming back to Australia as soon as I can, and the first place that I want to go is but amongst my Black brothers, the Indigenous people of Australia," end quote. He understood Aboriginal Australians and African Americans as undergoing similar struggles in two different white settler societies. In calling Aboriginal Australians his, quote, Black brothers, he envisioned a Black and Indigenous coalition that transcended national borders. As Anne Kuthors notes in her examination of this tour, he understood an alliance between Indigenous Australians and African Americans as integral to combating a global white supremacy, and expressed his desire to return to Australia and forge these alliances. Due to declining health, Robeson unfortunately never made it back to Australia, though he left a lasting impact on the country that had for decades before his arrival fell in love with his voice and his activism. Despite his inability to return to Australia, the solidarity building for which he so adamantly advocated emerged in the form of other culture producers taking up his work through performance, and thus creating a genealogy of resistance that continued his legacy. One such artist was the Aboriginal Australian singer Harold Blair. Anne Kuthors briefly mentions Harold Blair in her discussion of Robeson's tour. Here, I pick up where Kuthors left off, examining more closely Blair's use of performance as a site of protest, specifically fighting for the rights of his own people against these ongoing forms of settler colonial violence. When Australians said the name Robeson, sometimes they did not mean Paul Robeson at all, but Harold Blair. Born in 1924, Harold Blair was an internationally acclaimed opera singer whose artistic and political career spanned over 3 decades, who boasted a number of accomplishments, including a teaching position at the Melbourne Conservatorium of Music. While beginning his career in the 1940s, as several Australian newspapers have stated, he was discovered by a member of the Australian Railway Union, and thus his popularity grew to new heights after touring in Europe and the US. Following an invitation from Todd Duncan, an African-American performer, Blair spent a year studying music and performing in the US in 1950. It was after this tour abroad, notes Andrew King, when Blair became even more famous back in Australia. Yet part of his appeal resulted from his striking resemblance to Paul Robeson. His physique, calming presence, and voice, what one Australian newspaper in 1947 called, quote, spellbinding, were all qualities that Australians often cited when comparing the two performers. Australian newspapers frequently likened Blair to Robeson, calling him, for instance, quote, Australia's future Paul Robeson, or, as you can see from these two newspaper clippings, calling him that he may be Paul Robeson or that he is our Paul Robeson. Like his predecessor, Blair captured audiences not only, quote, because of his really fine voice, but also because of his engaging personality, end quote. He had also had ties to leftist organizations, similar to Robeson. Whereas Robeson claimed membership to organizations like the IWO, and often gave concerts that were financially supported and in support of these leftist organizations, Blair also had ties to leftist political circles. His singing career, for instance, started after being discovered by a member of the Australian Railway Union, as I mentioned before. And he continued to receive support from the Brisbane Trades and Labour Council throughout his career. His activism took a number of forms. In addition to serving on the Aboriginal Arts Board to advocate for Aboriginal artists and in supporting workers' rights by running for the Australian Parliament in 1964, he too, like Robeson, used the stage to protest the mistreatment of his own people. During a performance in 1949, for instance, he responded to the violent arrest of Aboriginal strikers in Western Australia by stating, quote, why should they be arrested at revolver point? Has the government lost all interest in the people who own this land before the white man? End quote. Not only did he condemn the violent policing of Aboriginal workers, but he also understood this policing as a continuation of the Australian settler colonial project that involved land dispossession, among other violent acts. Like Robeson, he specifically condemned the White Australia policy. Built on years of white settler expansion into Western and Northern Australia, sexual violence against Aboriginal women, and the forced removal of Aboriginal children from their homes, the White Australia policy's purpose was to create a homogenous, modern White Australia, which became increasingly urgent as Australia entered nationhood at the turn of the 20th century. Scholars most often locate this policy within the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, which, amongst many things in terms of preventing the vast majority of immigrants of color from entering the country, also reinforced the settler colonial project that had been going on for decades. And you can see this sort of reinforcement and reproduction of this policy, not only through practice, but also through representation, right? Through sheet music, such as this 1910 song called White Australia, Australia, the White Man's Land, as well as this 1928 film, which in many ways was similar to The Birth of a Nation in 1915. This film came out in 1928, and it was called The Birth of White Australia, and kind of traced the trajectory of settlement, but was obviously very sort of in the service of justifying white settler colonialism. And so these are just a few examples of the ways in which representation also sort of reinforced this association of Australian nationhood with whiteness. Harold Blair drew inspiration from his activism with Robeson throughout his career. In an interview with the South Australian Tribune in 1949, Blair stated, quote, he admired the work of Paul Robeson on behalf of the American Negroes and, quote, hoped to meet Paul Robeson when he was in America. Well, he did in fact meet Robeson, Ann Cathro states, during this tour, specifically when he and his wife Islanda visited Melbourne, and I'm referring to the 1960 tour of Robeson in Australia. Now, I'm still researching this encounter between Blair and Robeson, and so I don't have, at this point, further details about their meeting. However, I'm imagining that this must have been a significant moment for the two performers, one well-established and one newly emerging, to come together in the spirit of solidarity building and in the spirit of forging these tangible and long-lasting alliances that linked African-American struggles and the struggles of Indigenous Australians. In some ways, however, we have to be critical a little bit of Blair's political work. Blair's advocacy in some ways played into the assimilationist logic of settler colonialism. Australians particularly knew him for his Children's Holiday Project, wherein he brought a select number of Aboriginal children from settlements in Queensland to stay with white Melbourne families for several weeks during the Christmas holidays, calling them, quote, the best of their age group, as a Queensland newspaper describes a young group of children whom Blair had brought from their homes to Melbourne. The newspaper expressed a hope that they, quote, take the opportunity to exploit the great advantage fully, end quote. Blair brought such children to Melbourne, to live with white families and expose them to modern luxuries and entertainment of Australian city life. Blair's children's project, it's important to know, existed within this longer history of Aboriginal child removal practices. In White Mother to a Dark Race, Margaret Jacobs looks extensively at how this process and its ideological justifications unfolded not only in Australia, but also in the US. As the title of her book suggests, white women were critical agents of this form of state violence. In this highly gendered apparatus, white women reformers made it their mission to circulate images that pathologized Aboriginal families, particularly their sexual division of labor. Any deviation from a kind of white patriarchal family structure fell under the category of, quote, neglect. And so through this language of uplift, white women sought to justify the removal of Aboriginal children as necessary from, quote unquote, rescuing them, right, from their upbringing. In casting these women as unfit and in need of rescue, white women thus also infantilized Aboriginal women. And so they also, at the same time as they infantilized Aboriginal women, they also cast themselves as the kind of, quote, great white mother to Aboriginal families. Indigenous child removal was one of many Australian policies aimed at controlling Aboriginal populations, either through assimilation or segregation. A nationwide structure for managing Australian populations did not exist, but it was rather sort of spread out across states, right? It was state specific and incorporated a mixture of protection, assimilation, and segregation approaches. Already dispossessed of their lands, Aboriginal Australians did not figure as a threat because they were also considered a quote unquote dying race. By the second decade, of the 20th century, arguments for nationwide surveillance emerged, with entities like the Australian Board of Missions and the Association of the Protection of Native Races calling for the federal government to step up and accept responsibility for Indigenous Australians and the discriminatory treatment that they were facing. By the 1930s, Aboriginal-led groups like the Australian Aborigines League joined the debates, demanding that the federal government create national policy that would ensure equal rights and sovereignty for Aboriginal Australians. And so I just wanted to share that to kind of give you context for the various forms of settler colonial violence that both Robeson and Blair were protesting, specifically these child removal practices, which have created so much trauma for stolen generations currently. And so Harold Blair emerged on the stage during the 50s and 60s within this larger context, right, of national efforts by Indigenous Australians to demand their sovereignty rights, right, and to demand an end to these child removal practices, which didn't really end until the 70s. While his children's project might have depended on assimilationist ideas, Blair also made efforts to instill cultural pride in Aboriginal children. In addition to bringing Aboriginal children from settlements to Melbourne, as I previously discussed, he also went to Aboriginal communities, as you can see in this newspaper clipping, to sing traditional songs to Aboriginal children and to really kind of be in conversation with the very children that he was in some ways trying to assimilate. Here we see also Harold Blair, along with other Aboriginal Australian activists, celebrating National Aborigines Day in 1963. And so this is just one of many ways that Harold Blair was, on the one hand, sort of falling into some of the assimilationist rhetoric, but also trying to persistently advocate for his people. And so I now return to these two photos, one of Robeson in 1960 and one of Harold Blair in 1951, both interacting with children and trying to really kind of understand their legacy together, and specifically how this legacy was sort of filtered through their interactions with children. That's sort of my next direction with this project. And so Robeson's legacy and vision of such an alliance of African American and Indigenous Australians lived on in the work of Harold Blair, who continued to advocate for his people until his death in 1976, which actually was the same year that Paul Robeson passed away. Both of their work reveal how performance served as a site of interracial solidarity across the Pacific. Their work also illuminates the limits of such alliance building, particularly given the effects and longstanding effects of state surveillance. Together, however, Robeson and Blair constituted a genealogy of resistance that stretched before and after the important work that they performed. Thank you.
Thank you so much for another great illuminating paper, Dr. Bevel. Now our final paper, Dr. Ian Rocksborough-Smith.
Thanks, Dr. Bernstelli, and thank you to all the panelists as well as the ASA for putting on this session. Really thankful to be a part of it. Yeah, I guess I'm very thankful to be the last paper on the session as well. So my paper, focuses on the historical figure and important figure on the Black left and the history of the Black left in America. And I think I'm still under-recognized in those histories, Jack Hunter Pitts Odell. My paper was introduced as being sort of focused on his impact on the history of activism in the Pacific Northwest. And I think I'll kind of situate this paper more as a personal and scholarly reflection from someone who considered himself to be a close friend and mentored by Mr. Odell in his time living in the Pacific Northwest. It was kind of a personal, political, and scholarly paper all at once. So full disclosure, Jack Odell was both a mentor and a very close friend of mine. I visited he and his wife, Jane Power, who were both really impactful on my own life when I was in my early 20s, and I'm now in my mid 40s. I used to visit their home regularly in the Kitsilano neighborhood of Vancouver, British Columbia, where they lived from the early 1990s until they passed away from Mr. Odell just a few years ago in 2019, just before the pandemic started. And then sadly, Jane Power, his wife, just passed away last fall after some battle with illness. I've been fortunate to be working very closely with them, as well as one of my old graduate supervisors, Dr. Karen Ferguson, who's at Simon Fraser University, working for many years to assemble many of the papers that Mr. Odell and Jane Power collected amongst themselves in their apartment in Kitsilano. And some of those materials have been delivered from Mr. Odell to the Schomburg Library in New York, where there's a collection, a small collection of his materials, but there's a much larger one still being processed as matters of the estate are worked out. And I'm hoping to continue to be involved in helping to sort of steward that process. So it's something I take very seriously, and I will see it to its conclusion as long as I'm available and asked to assist. Now, as I noted, they both of them passed over the last few years. I had a picture of them, which you can see right here. This is a picture I took in 2005, approximately, in just on their porch in Kitsilano in Vancouver. And they're people who I miss dearly, and so this is a very personal presentation in a lot of ways as well. I don't see them just as historical subjects. They're people that I lived and laughed with and ate food with and commiserated with about many things that were happening in the world in my youth, including the unjust war in Iraq in the early 2000s, the imperialist hegemony that the U.S. and its allies unleashed on the world, which we can continue to see legacies of today, particularly to do with matters in the Middle East, but of course elsewhere in the world where Western imperialism continues. So they're both people who impacted not only myself, of course, but many other folks here in the Pacific Northwest, where they lived out much of their retirement, but also around especially the United States, where they had many friends and allies on both coasts of the United States. My paper is given here, especially in conversation with many of their close friends and allies, particularly, I already mentioned Dr. Karen Ferguson, but also Dr. Nikhil Pal Singh, who was instrumental in getting the first sort of edited volume of Jack Waddell's collected writings out a number of years ago for the University of California Press in a volume called The Climbing Jacob's Ladder, which I urge any viewers to check out if they ever get a chance. Other people include John Monroe, who's a scholar in the United Kingdom, but like myself, was from the Pacific Northwest originally, and was equally mentored by Jack Waddell and Jane Power. Dr. Michael Zweig, who is a retired professor of economics, a radical Marxist professor. Sharon Maeda, who is a key figure in Pacifica Radio in the Pacific Northwest. Filmmaker Rami Katz, who recently produced an excellent documentary on Jack Waddell's life. It's very accessible. You can easily find it online for free. And thankful that he was able to put that documentary together. And Rami himself is also from the Pacific Northwest. And then Jack and Jane also deeply influenced the establishment of an organization in the Pacific Northwest here called the Institute for Community Leadership. And two of the key leaders of that group include Nyla Rosen and Roy Wilson. And other folks in the Pacific Northwest here who were deeply influenced by Mr. Waddell and Jane Power. And I think it's important to actually consider them together because they were, over much of their lives and labors, very connected in what they did and how they interacted. And for many years before they moved to the Pacific Northwest, and I'll get into this a little bit more in the paper, they lived in Washington, D.C. When Jack was working with Push Rainbow in the DC area. So as I've already stated, you could say that I'm definitely from the Pacific Northwest School of Jack Waddell Studies and Learners, as I like to call it. Again, probably best symbolized by the Jack Waddell Education Reflection Center, which is part of the Institute for Community Leadership. It's located in Kent, Washington. And I actually have never gone there. I'm sort of on the Canadian side of things. But there's a whole group of folks in Washington State that Jack Waddell and Jane Power worked with who would equally have reflections on their lives and labors. I remain convinced, as I was though when I was 23, when I first met Jack Waddell. And incidentally, this is a connection to Dr. Bevel's paper. This was in 2002 approximately. And I actually traveled with some Palestinian solidarity activists who I was working with at the time to the Peace Arch border crossing, where we went to a 50th anniversary commemoration of the concert that Paul Robeson gave to mine and mill workers who all gathered in 1952, as you probably know, on the border between Canada and the United States, Canada and Washington State. And Paul Robeson played his piano because he couldn't cross the border, right on the border to this audience in the park. And if you ever go there today, it's a big, huge sort of green space right near the ocean. It's quite a scene to kind of remember that there was this huge gathering of workers and unions that all came from all across different parts of Canada to hear Paul Robeson sing. And it speaks to the impact that he had at the height of McCarthyism in that period. But of course, Jack Waddell and Jane Power came out to that commemoration as well. And that's around the time that I was fortunate to meet them. And I met them in the context of being an anti-war Palestinian solidarity activist in my early 20s, which is something that they had been doing their entire lives as well. International solidarity, both Jane and Jack, especially in the late 20th century, were sort of instrumental, I believe, in trying to inject a pro-Palestinian perspective into progressive US politics, which of course in the context of the 1970s or 80s would have been a very, very tall task, notwithstanding how challenging it is today to have that issue properly recognized and addressed. And recently there was there's more happening now, you could say, to kind of recognize the impact that the Jack Waddell's had as a figure in the civil rights movement. And I'll get into some of the particulars, which are quite important. But there was a conference recently held at the University of Washington in Seattle last January that I was fortunate to attend. And lots of folks there who were on sort of keynotes and plenaries will be putting their papers into an edited collection that the University of Washington Press is hopefully going to be putting out through the great leadership of Dr. Moonho Jung, who's at University of Washington, Seattle. So look forward to that edited volume coming out, because there's some great papers that should be in it. So a little more about Jack Waddell, especially for the viewers who might not know who he was. Paul Buell, who is a historian of the left, wrote in a review of Nikhil Pal Singh's marvelous edited compendium of Jack Waddell's freedom movement writings called Simon Jacob's Ladder, which was published nearly 10 years ago, suggested that Odell's story speaks to the ultimate political and cultural history of the left, so often undiscussed or discussed only among trusted friends. And I've already mentioned a recent film by the Vancouver-based documentarian Rami Katz called The Issue of Mr. Odell, which explores Odell's significance in an even more accessible way. And as I said before, it's well worth a watch. John Monroe's The Anti-Colonial Front is also a fantastic volume to consult for more on Mr. Odell's radical internationalism and commitment to anti-colonial thought and practice. And another project worth checking out is the Africa World Now project, which offers an educational platform to reconnect Africa with its known and forgotten parts. Not long ago, when Jack Waddell passed away, members of that project recently indicated to me that Jack Waddell is essential to understanding the long tradition of Africana radical praxis. When he worked with a magazine called Freedom Ways magazine, produced in New York in the early 1960s, he, along with Dr. Robert Rhodes and Tom Porter, were connected and comrades through the 1970s. And this especially materialized when Mr. Odell was teaching economic history at Antioch College in the 1970s in Washington, D.C. So, as you can likely guess, Jack Waddell is connected to a lot of different movements and spheres of activism. Probably most significantly for the historical record, he was a civil rights and peace organizer, trade unionist. He even worked as an insurance for a while in the 1950s. And of course, he was a member of the Communist Party in the early 1950s before he left the party in the late 1950s and joined the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, working closely with Dr. Martin Luther King and other staff as one of their key staffers, organizing both fundraising and Southern voter registration. So he actually had like 2 full-time jobs with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference moving into the early 1960s. Later on in his life, he was already mentioned, he was an associate professor of economic history at Antioch College in the 1970s. You got to remember too, this is someone who was an autodidact. He never had a PhD or anything like that, but he was more brilliant than most PhDs. He was a policy advisor became a policy advisor for Push Rainbow in the 1970s and 80s, which I already indicated. Also a member of the National Sane Freeze Peace Movement Board. He was a board member of the Birmingham-based Southern Organizing Committee, as well as chair of the National Board of Pacifica Radio through the 1990s. Mr. Odell traveled extensively around the world, from Latin America throughout Africa to the Middle East and around Asia. And he firmly believed in the need for radical internationalism to oppose the forces of racial capitalism in particular. And indeed, as Jesse Jackson's foreign policy advisor in the 1980s, Odell was one of the first and sadly few American ambassadors, frankly, to interact officially with Palestinian political leaders as if they were actually human beings. So Mr. Odell's lifetime of activism remains instructive for continuing to unearth histories of radical social change thinkers intimately engaged in the battles for civil rights in America over the long 20th century. And I really urge viewers or any listeners to this this panel, to check out Mr. Rodell's life and works, and to study his writings in particular, because I think they're very instructive for thinking about the present context and the sort of conjunctures of racism, imperialism, wealth inequality that so many face in the current period. So I think I'll leave it at that. There is more that I can talk about, but I'd love to actually hear from the other panelists and perhaps hear some questions from Professor Burton-Stelly and any others who might want to be a part of this conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Dr. Rocksborough-Smith. Thank you all for these papers that I think had a lot of synergy, especially the emphasis on sort of communist and communist adjacent individuals, formations, and practices. I just wanted to ask each of you a question. There was some perhaps contradictions that arose maybe in each of your presentations that I wanted to hear you all talk about. So starting with Robert. So you talked about the usage of these figures like Jefferson, like Washington, who were bosses, right? They're slaveholders, they're warmongers, right? When the basis of these schools were arguing for liberation from the bosses. And so I wanted to hear you speak a little bit about this contradiction, and because this even preceded, right, the Popular Front moment, when this was also in the class versus class, or the third period moment. And so I wanted to hear you speak a little bit about that. For Felicia, so you mentioned settler colonialism, right? And as the basis of Paul Robeson and Harold Blair's critique. But in my understanding, one of the sort of shortcomings of the Communist Party is that they did not have an analysis of settler colonialism. One only needs to look at the Black Belt thesis to see that there is no settler colonialism in terms of, and that, you know, and it's not as if that term didn't exist, right, and wasn't accessible. And so are you reading settler colonialism into, at least in the case of Paul Robeson, into their praxis, and sort of what are you maybe giving more credit? Are you, is this a sort of a historical reading, or like did the term settler colonialism actually appear in their writings? And if not, how are you able to sort of offer them as critics of settler colonialism, right? And then finally for Ian, so Jack O'Dell, who's, love him, amazing, by the way. He went from the CPUSA, a atheist, non-religious organization, to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, a decidedly religious and frankly anti-communist in many ways organization. And so I wondered if you can talk, and he wasn't a reverend or pastor, correct, to my understanding. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about that transition, and if you saw, and was that a de-radicalizing move? Was it simply a shift to where the correlation of forces were with the civil rights movement? I just wondered if you could speak a little bit about that. So thank you all again for your papers.
Should we just each respond? Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's, thank you. Really, that's a big question. I mean, and I always worried when I first started looking into this stuff just before COVID, and then et cetera. So boy, it's been a while. The schools, that is. I mean, I wondered if I was being used ahistorical, like, because my eyebrows did go up. They're teaching classes in Negro slave revolts, but in the Thomas Jefferson School, and they're lionizing Jefferson as, you know, a great Democrat, small d Democrat. So there are contradictions there. I'm not 100% sure, but I'll say it was Jack Stackel, because I could check later. It's not important, but there is somebody at the Jefferson School who talks about the Democratic promise of the American Revolution, and in some of their classes they talk about it as a great moment. And then he says now, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, but he says now, of course, they were a bourgeois revolution. They were for property, and they had they advanced slavery. And he says, but, and it's kind of the historic scientific Marxism. He doesn't put it very crudely, but he says they nevertheless were in advance, over what came before. And he says, of course, they were led by property owners. So what a surprise! This is the kind of revolution they made. But yeah, there are tensions there. I mean, like I said, they in the Jeff School they'll have classes celebrating Louverture and the Haitian Revolution, and we know, right? Jefferson was totally appalled by that for obvious reasons, his own self-interest. But it's kind. You're right. It's kind of like what Dimitrov said at the beginning of the Popular Front, though. He said, these are the cultures and history of the people, and if we totally dismiss them, I mean, I find some of the writing in the 20s which denounces, the American Revolution as totally, reactionary. Or there's an article by Mike Gold saying, everybody says Lincoln was great, but he says no, Lincoln was a capitalist, and it was horrible, and he didn't do anything to free anybody. But it's kind of, if you're trying to attract the American working class, and then you say, oh, relax, your entire history was garbage. I mean, I think by 1935, a lot of people in the party, first of all, by that point they were second generation. They said, well, there is good stuff in our past. It's got a lot of horrible stuff, but we're not going to totally dismiss it, or we're never going to attract people. And I don't know, that's just my take. I've got to think on it more, but yeah, there is definitely a tension between lionizing the past, even though they kind of, but they never say Thomas Jefferson was, great, and slavery, like the things American public schools are saying in the 40s, that slavery was necessary to civilize people, God help us, right? So they don't I don't know, they don't whitewash Jefferson, but on the other hand, they do embrace him. So am I digging myself even further into this hole? You're absolutely right. There are a lot of tensions there, but thank you for the question.
So, thank you so much, Dr. Bernstein, for your comments. Yes, I do agree that there are a lot of tensions in this sort of work that I'm looking at in terms of kind of the resistance work of Harold Blair and Robeson. Perhaps I am applying a kind of term that we all are very familiar with and use as academics to the work that Robeson and Blair were doing. However, I would say that Robeson did talk in other interviews, aside from his 1960 tour, earlier during his career, he would talk about colonialism kind of more broadly, in the ways in which he wanted to ensure that his artistic career wasn't kind of reproducing various kind of representations that would be in the service of colonialism. So some of the earlier films that he was involved in, there was one where it was, I believe it was set in Nigeria, and he was, after the film came out, he was very explicit about not wanting to reproduce a kind of logic of British colonialism. And that was kind of a turning point where he was really publicly saying, I want to use my artistry as a form of protest, that I don't want to, in one context, say one thing, but then the film that I am performing in say another narrative, right? So he wanted the two to align. And so, yes, I would say that earlier since from the 1940s onward, he was especially explicit about critiques of colonialism. Now, settler colonialism as a specific term, I wasn't seeing as much of that term that he was using specifically. I will say for Harold Blair, that also was a term that he wasn't using explicitly. They both were talking about the various forms of violence that we as scholars today would associate with settler colonialism, but they weren't necessarily saying the term settler. And so, yes, I may need to rethink how I'm using that in my paper here. But it is definitely clear that Robeson was really kind of made anti-colonialist rhetoric central to his political work internationally. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for the questions, Dr. Bernstelli. I guess in terms of Jack Odell's decisions to shift and join the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, I can distinctly remember when I was fortunate to interview him for the first time in my early 20s. I remember him clearly saying to me, he said, in the late 1950s, you could see that the civil rights movement was the thing in the United States, with the constellation of forces that were ongoing with the Cold War. And he told me that he made like a strategic decision to, leave the radical left, at least officially, and join Southern Christian Leadership Conference, join the civil rights movement, to use those terms, as it was emerging in the late 1950s, or re-emerging. And so it was sort of like a strategic decision. And, thinking back on that statement, I mean, there's lots to unpack in terms of, why individuals and people choose to make those kinds of choices to join up with organizations that are, that are nominally, perhaps conservative in orientation or socially conservative in orientation. You think about the strategic choices that people make, and the sort of compromises that people can make in making those kinds of choices under certain political, ideological conditions. I think it would have been no doubt a tough choice, but one that I think made sense for Mr. Odell at the time. I mean, he had a huge impact, I believe, on Southern Christian Leadership Conference, taking on 2 major staffing roles. And that his time with that organization didn't last terribly long, because the FBI, as many people know, was hounding folks on not just the left side of the political spectrum, but anyone that purported to speak sometimes of civil rights or human rights, unless it was done in a certain fashion. And it was very clear that Jack Odell was targeted while he was working with SCLC. He was one of 2 people that J. Edgar Hoover singled out to John F. Kennedy in the months just leading up to the March on Washington in 1963. And as I understand it, it was a mutual decision between Mr. Odell and Dr. King that he leave SCLC. And right at that point, he decided to join up with the editorial staff of Freedom Ways magazine in New York, because he'd been associated with Esther Cooper Jackson and her husband, James Jackson, who, of course, remained very closely connected to the Communist Party. But he'd met them when he'd been a youth organizer in the 1940s, coming out of his experiences in the National Maritime Union. And he'd actually been at some of the conferences, like the Southern Negro Youth Congress conferences in his youth. So he'd had those experiences to draw on, and those relationships to reconnect with in the early 1960s. And I think Mr. Odell might be best kind of understood as someone who was certainly a fellow traveler of the radical left, and remained, I guess you could say, able to kind of strategically interact with folks who were on the radical left, but also able to kind of meet people in the center or even on the right sometimes, depending on their perspectives. Because I think he also really believed in kind of like a non-sectarian style of kind of coalition building politics, right? And I think that extended into his political praxis later on in life. And I think if I were to connect it to how I knew Mr. Odell and Jane Power in the time that I got to know them in the 1990s or early 2000s, from their time of having moved to Canada in the 1990s, you know, they were social democrats. They were people that supported the New Democratic Party here in British Columbia and Canada, which is sort of the left of, you know, the mainstream electoral political spectrum, if you will. And they were people that, you know, the current premier of British Columbia, for example, is someone who actually met Mr. Odell on a couple of occasions and was arguably influenced by him. And so these are all examples of the ways that I think Mr. Odell and his wife, Jane Power, who is someone who should actually be studied in her own right. She was an editor of the National Education Association newsletter for many years during her career when they lived in DC, and very much a scholar of Palestine, and very much understood the impacts of Western imperialism and the history of the Middle East and the world. So, you know, I think they're people who were able to kind of operate in different areas and you know, interact with many different people where they were. And you know, they were actually very religious people too, which is something that not a lot of people know. Jack was actually raised Catholic, although he had a lot of criticisms of the Catholic Church and its history, as of course many people would. And you know, they were part of the sort of Congregationalist tradition, you could say, by the end of their lives. They call it the United Church here in Canada, which is one of the more kind of progressive denominations, you could say, of Protestant Christianity. So, you know, they did kind of operate in these different communities and worlds because I think they really believed in connecting people across ideologies and creeds and backgrounds, obviously.
Thank you all. We don't appear to have any questions in the chat, unless I'm overlooking something. Let me look. Do you all have any questions for each other? We also don't have to beat a dead horse, but I want to give you all the full sort of an hour, 45 minutes, and or let you go if there's no further conversation, but please.
Okay. I don't know. I've got a question, but I just, as you were talking, Felicia, I had a thought, and I'll send it to you later if I can find it. When I'm in the archives, probably I'm like everybody. It's like, this is cool and interesting, and I have no idea if I'll need it, and I take a photo anyway. But the Australian Communist Party had a pamphlet sometime in the 30s, which was denouncing the treatment of Indigenous or Aboriginal, or whatever words you want to use. I don't know how they characterized it, if they used the phrase settler colonialism, but I'm wondering if Harold Blair was, you said, on the left of some connections. Was he, I'm going to sound like Senator McCarthy, was he now, or did he ever, was he a communist? You know, would he have known what they were writing about it? But I'll try to find it and email you if I can.
Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah.
Especially given, because that was sort of what I was grappling with as I was researching Blair, and thinking about the range of his political work, and especially, like I mentioned, that the bringing the children to Melbourne, you know, especially given that history of, you know, violence against stolen generations and the ways in which various government-owned settlements, such as Corandurk, would serve as tourist sites, right, where white Australians would come from Melbourne to go to the settlements and gaze upon Aboriginal Australians. And so it's kind of like a reverse process that's happening, where Blair is taking these children from the settlements and bringing them to cities to stay with white families. And so I'm looking more into that and definitely want to present a more nuanced analysis of that. But it is interesting to kind of see the work that Blair was doing, especially as he was supported by unions and sort of other leftist entities. So I do want to look more into that.
Say maybe a question from myself would be to ask you, because I know that Australia is one of several different but somewhat similar settler colonial nations, and Canada is another one that's very similar to Australia in being kind of like a white settler colonial nation, that is connected to the British Empire and in its founding, right, and it enacted all kinds of violence against Indigenous peoples ongoing. And I'm not actually aware if Paul Robeson, perhaps made any of those kind of connections in Canada or other places. I just wondered if you had looked at those kind of other kind of the coordinates of these white settler colonial nations that were, part of the British Empire, in terms of his solidarities, which were, as you pointed out, manifold. But just wondering if you saw any other kind of connections to those kinds of settler colonial state histories.
Yes, and those are the two countries that I focus on in the larger work, Canada and Australia, and thinking about how. So I originally kind of approached this because of my examination of Showboat, which Robeson, of course, performed in, and how that circulated in both countries. And so from there, I was interested in thinking about how he, as a Black transnational performer, was kind of resisting the logic of white supremacy that culture productions like Showboat were kind of reinforcing. And so in Canada, I was specifically looking sort of during that time of containment. So not only looking at the 52 Peace Arch concert, but there were 2 other Peace Arch concerts that he performed in 53. And during the 53 concert, so it's interesting that Jack O'Dell, it was great to hear about Jack O'Dell's visit to Peace Arch. But thinking about how Robeson was also, during that concert, expressing his solidarity with China, for instance. And so during that concert, he sang a Chinese marching song in kind of solidarity with emerging independence movements, which then, of course, kind of prefaced the 1955 Bandung Conference, where he sent the recording of Old Man River. And so, I think that's probably the most explicit support that he showed for decolonization movements, right? Was that Bandung recording that he did. But yes, I am trying to kind of think about the connections between Canada and Australia as white settler societies, and how Black performers, as they were kind of on the move and performing in various films or stage productions, were also using the stage to protest that. So yes, Canada is the other site that I'm researching, and which also, of course, has a history of violent child removal practices.
Yeah, definitely. Canada has an ongoing to be and continuously written history of that, as you probably know. So,
right.
It sounds like great work. I'm looking forward to reading it. So.
Thank you.
It's you mentioned too, Ian, that Jack was either by mutual agreement or maybe not had to leave SCLC because of his communist past. I mean, that seems to be, I guess, what I was finding the most disconcerting, and why, like in the schools or any of the institutions, any taint of a communist past, and I'm not, he seems like he landed on his feet, was given as a reason for stigmatizing a movement or whatever. I mean, the guy who was the director of the Jefferson School, Doxy Wilkerson, quit the party in '58, and he actually, I mean, he still was a, advocate of educational opportunity for African Americans, but he increasingly became somewhat more conservative. But, again, there are letters to newspapers, why is this man still teaching at a university? He was a communist, into like the late 1960s, 70s. So that, and of course, Robeson, right, never, I don't know if it's known if he was a member, but, I think you said it, Charisse, like communist aligned or adjacent or whatever phrase that ruined his life, not just his career. So I see that as the bigger tragedy. These people who were progressives, got tainted, and I think not just for their personal lives, but it precluded the possibility or narrowed the possibility of reform or activism, amazingly. And maybe I'm stating the obvious, but I think I see that as a commonality in the papers. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's also interesting and a testament to Robeson's resistance that he was able, in spite of the physical containment, was still able to find these creative ways to still express his solidarity. And so, yes, I mean, not just Robeson, but Du Bois and others, right, who came under attack during that time and were literally unable to leave the country. And the after effects of that, right? The fact that, towards the end of his life, Robeson becomes physically and mentally ill, and sort of how can we understand that as the after effects of years of surveillance? But to also realize that his legacy continued, right? It continued through even that's why at the end of the presentation, I was sort of focusing more on their interactions with children, because, as well as Bob, I'm recently was doing work on Robeson's performances in the IWO, and especially his performances with children and for children, and sort of how he saw them as a kind of future generation, right, of political activists, right, that he became not just the performer, but also the audience, right, that he listened to children as they were singing the very songs that he sang to them back to him. And so, I think we can kind of find encouragement or, a sort of way in which, in spite of the surveillance and persecution that they faced, their legacy still lived on in youth activists. And so that's why I was particularly interested in this kind of like dissent, curriculum of dissent that we were talking about, right? Because that as the kind of pedagogical genealogy is one form of continuing this legacy that we are probably all thinking about right now as educators.
Yeah, and thanks. Yeah, as you were talking, it was like, my half pessimistic, half glass side should remember the optimism. Yeah, there were all kinds of, not just, there were obviously still schools ran in the 60s and 70s. It's just, I mean, when you look at the catalogs, because I was at NYU dumpster diving at Wagner Tenement, right? And I mean, the catalog by the end of the 50s, or excuse me, the end of the Jefferson School, it was like 70 pages. It was huge, right? The number of offerings, the number of students, and then as people were afraid they were going to be, called before HUAC, their student numbers declined. But the schools that were run in the 70s would be like, a little pamphlet, like 5 pages. These are the courses we're doing, this coming semester. But yeah, there were all kinds of people who remained active, in sub rosa ways. I found out Harold Washington's director of culture, when he was mayor of Chicago, was a former communist, former IWO school youth leader in Chicago, a man named Fred Fine, and he actually did get confirmed by the Chicago City Council. They raked him over the coals as a former communist, and if everybody remembers, Washington was in constant warfare with the Board of Aldermen, and a lot of them were, representatives from Eastern European communities, and they were saying, in articles in the Chicago Tribune, this man is a commie and my Polish constituents won't stand for it. Well, he was confirmed, right? And was the director of, educational and cultural programs in Harold Washington's phenomenal but too brief administration in Chicago, right? So, yeah, and there were people who were still, involved in the civil rights activism in the 60s and 70s. So the institutions were killed, but it wasn't like every person, went back to their home and gave up on the cause of whatever the cause was. And then, yeah, that's important to remember, I guess. Yeah. Thank you. I got to remember that in my moments of despair, too frequent.
Yeah, I think there's probably some connections as well to certainly the lives and labors of Jack Odell and Jane Power, his wife, in terms of focus on progressive education, right? Like I mentioned that Jane Power was the editor of the National Education Association newsletter in DC. This was around the time when Mr. Odell was working as like the foreign policy advisor for Jesse Jackson for Push Rainbow, and so they were intimately involved in pushing for progressive education initiatives. And Mr. Odell worked in and for Antioch College as an economic historian, and this was like a community college that attracted lots of first generation college students into a program. So it was a way to kind of engage communities that would have been underserved in terms of access to education. And when they moved to Canada, which is a whole other story that probably don't have time for, that they make these connections in the Pacific Northwest, and they help establish what becomes known as the Institute for Community Leadership, which is in Kent, Washington. And that was very much kind of like as I understand how it functions, it doesn't sound that different from some of these workers' schools that you're writing about, Bob, in that paper. Just for the 21st century, I guess, in terms of how it's manifested, because the folks who started that organization were all part of the progressive left up and down the West Coast, and Jack and Jane had and maintained contacts with people in progressive movements all up and down the coast in their retirement years. And, they would travel down to Oakland to meet with longshore workers and workers' education initiatives, and then they would be up in Seattle, working with the folks in the Institute for Community Leadership. So there was this, at least in the Pacific time zone, where they could operate the best in their retirement years. They remained connected with lots of these kind of progressive educational initiatives. Even in Vancouver, where they lived, they regularly volunteered their time at an East Side elementary school. one of their close friends taught at, and so this was a school that had a lot of Indigenous school children who attended it, and so they spent a lot of time just listening to the children and talking to them, and volunteering of their time to share their experiences and worldviews. So I think that connects in a lot of ways to so the legacies of some of the work that everyone's doing on the panel.
And then you're continuing that legacy, right? You said that you were involved in collaborating with the Schomburg to continue to archive some of Jack Waddell's materials.
Yeah. I mean, some of the material that he had, that he himself sent when he was still alive, went to the Schomburg, and I think the rest of it is still sort of up in the air as to where it will go. I know they wanted it to go to New York, one of the archives in New York, so that remains to be seen. They had connections with Calumet as well, so
right.
Both are great.
Sorry.
Archives. Yep.
I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm so sorry. There's a question in the chat from Sabine, so I'll just read this and you all can respond in your own way. Thank you for the papers. I'm interested in the ways that anti-Black and anti-racism work across the border from the U.S. to Australia and from the U.S. to Canada and back. Because each nation has produced race differently, could you comment on how the analysis and strategies of resistance might have changed?
Yes, thank you so much for your question. Yes, so the ways in which kind of Blackness is operating, both in terms of how Robeson is seeing, right, his own Blackness in operation as he's navigating Australia, right, where sort of his celebrity status in some ways is, the function of him as Black celebrity in Australia is something that is important to consider, and how he was kind of attaching his own understanding of a kind of African American rooted Blackness in a different context, right? Where by the time you get to the late 1960s and 1970s, for instance, Aboriginal Australian activists were in some ways kind of taking up, for instance, Black Power, the mantra of Black Power, right? Activists like Gary Foley, who was involved in the Aboriginal Tent Embassy, were reading Malcolm X, and they were kind of understanding their struggles for sovereignty within the kind of context of Black Power struggles in the United States. And so it's interesting to see kind of how that is transported and taken up and given new meaning within this other settler colonial context. But the term Blackness is very complicated too, right? The ways in which Blackness was also used by white Australians, right, to negatively portray Indigenous Australians is something that is also part of the current conversation, right? What the terminology of Black or Blackness is fraught. And so that's sort of also what I'm trying to unpack. What does that solidarity look like when Blackness has these different meanings in different contexts?
And first of all, hello, and thanks for the question virtually. Nice to quote, see you. The two things that come to mind immediately is, first of all, like correct me if I'm wrong, Felicia, the white Australia policy was certainly, anti-Aboriginal, but it was more or less targeted to the quote yellow peril, right? Which is, a big issue as well, and that does connect it to Canada and the U.S., right, which had the Chinese Exclusion Act from 1882. So that might be fruitful to look at too, Asian solidarities between the countries if they existed. The thing that comes to mind, though, is UNIA, the Garveyite movement, had chapters in all over the world, right? So I know for a fact they had them in Australia and, of course, the US, and in Nova Scotia. Apparently, Eric McDuffie's supposed to come. He came, and then COVID shut us down, and he had to fly back out. Never gave the talk at our university, but second time's the charm. But Eric is writing on UNIA now, and they had chapters with Black Nova Scotian lodges, and I know they had chapters in Australia, so that might be, and more explicitly or more detailed, I can't speak to, but that might be a place to look for those kind of anti-Black or anti-colonial solidarities. And I also immediately thought of Harry Bridges, right, who was Australian-born, but was a real kick-ass longshoreman leader in the Bay Area. And that's a prong that tied at least those two countries together, but probably also Canada as well, right? Because the West Coast, I forget what the acronym is, that Longshore Union, I think they had locals in BC as well.
They definitely did. I mean, that's something that I know both Jack Waddell and Jane Power, I think that's how they connected to the anti-racism work, was through sort of progressive union left activism, which they continue to be connected to. Like, they always attended when they could, the Pacific Northwest Labor History Association conference, which moved up and down between sort of Seattle, Vancouver, and Portland, Oregon, in the sort of Pacific Northwest region. And they were also, they were connected to anti-racist movements, especially in sort of internationalist ones that were sort of anti-war. The Palestinian solidarity networks active in the Northwest here, and I think, but just to connect to that question in a broader sense too, I think, as Bob was saying, there are important histories of anti-Asian racism, and then solidarities, anti-racist solidarities that I think, for example, Moodho Jung has written about, and I think it's no coincidence that he's also the person who's kind of bringing together this edited collection on the life and legacy of Jack Waddell in the United States, because it does connect to the Asian anti-racist solidarities and anti-imperialism that he's written about in his recent work. And I think that there are some really important sort of connections throughout the Pacific Northwest that connect to these larger coordinates of internationalist anti-racist struggle.
There is a book, and I can't be more specific than that at the moment, but Sabina, I could email it to you if I find it. The title, which was comparing the anti-Asian policies of Canada, Australia, and the U.S., and it probably also talked about the opposition to white Australia policy and Chinese exclusion in the U.S. as well. But that came out about 4, 5, 6 years ago. And I could find it if and when I get to my office again. Thanks.
Well, we have 1 minute left. Are there any sort of closing remarks you all would like to share as we move toward the end of our very, very interesting panel?
Your baby is super cute.
Thank you so much, Sankara. Well, thank you all again so much for sharing your amazing work. It's, I think, going to make contributions across several fields, not least American studies, but history, political theory, some historical sociology, etc. So thank you all so much for sharing your work. And I look forward, hopefully we can have another panel in person at ASA in the near future. But thank you all again. And thank you all for coming.